Welcome to the first in a series of podcast discussions between myself, Steve Phillip, founder and director of the Jordan Legacy, and my good friend, Dr. Manoj Krishna, a former spinal surgeon of more than 20 years and founder of HappierMe, a very different wellbeing app which helps people lead happier and more successful lives. During today's conversation, we're going to explore why many people are feeling a failure in their personal and professional lives, and how this sense of not being enough and being less than others can often lead to people experiencing serious mental health problems and even lead to thoughts of suicide. In 2022, the Jordan Legacy's own research identified that in the UK, 1 in 6 people experienced a mental health issue during the previous 12 months that required support. We lose more than 7,000 men, women, and children each year to suicide in the UK, and suicide is the biggest killer of men and women under 35. Manoj, people listening to the opening of our podcast today could be forgiven for thinking that we're in a pretty hopeless situation in the world right now. Why do you think so many people are feeling they're not enough and experiencing such a sense of defeat?
Yes. Before we go into that question, Steve, I wanted to also honor you and the work you've done with the Jordan Legacy in highlighting the issues of suicide, especially after you lost your own son, and what an impact that's made. And in our series of conversations, we're going to cover all the key areas which can be triggers for suicide, but it's much wider conversation than that because it's going to talk about well-being, mental health, and offer hope and practical tools and tips on how to overcome these issues. Okay, so to tackle the first question, why do we have this sense of failure? Well, I met a young man just this weekend who was in a loop of negative thinking. He's got a reasonably well-paid job in London, much better than average. But he was in this doom loop of negative thinking. I'm not good enough. I'm not doing enough with my career. I wish I could be doing more, and so on. And what was happening actually is two things. Firstly, he's like all young people, they consume a lot of social media. And on there, of course, people are doing much better. And interestingly, what I pointed out to him was your mind is comparing itself with people who are doing better than you and feeling terrible, but it's not comparing yourself with people who are not so well off and feeling good about that. See? So that's one thing. So it's the automatic process of comparison going on in our own mind, which we're not aware of, which then
And I
makes us
think,
feel bad.
and sorry, man, it's just a point to make there. You mentioned that, people are comparing themselves with other people having better lives. We're assuming they're having better lives, but of course they're often just showing that they're having a better life.
Exactly, because the person they're comparing themselves with is probably comparing themselves with somebody else who's, and so on. See? And so it's not the fact that you're not doing well enough that's causing you to feel bad. It's the fact that your mind's comparing itself with others or with your own ideas of what you should be. And both of them are linked to a process called conditioning. It's just a simple word which means our mind is influenced by our past or by social media in the present or friends, but we're not aware we're being influenced. That's the key thing to understand. So I might have grown up in a house where my father had very high expectations of me, and I've grown up thinking if I don't get here, I'm a failure. Not realizing the conditioning that came from my parents that has created that feeling in me. So once you wake up and realize that this feeling of not being good enough is based on you comparing, or your mind comparing itself with either your idea of who you should be, or others' idea of who you should be, or social media's idea of who you should be, or maybe in the company you want a promotion and you're not getting one, and so on. Once you realize your mind's creating your own suffering, then you can ask yourself, hey, is it possible for me not to compare myself with others unless I really need to? And that can bring freedom.
I think this is really, really fascinating. I'm a huge advocate of the work done by Professor Rory O'Connor from the University of Glasgow and the research that he's done around his own integrated motivational and volitional model for suicide behavior, shortened to IMV. And there are three phases to that model. We'll probably talk a little bit more about those during our conversation today. But right at the very beginning of the process, he talked about what it is that leads people towards that suicidal thinking. And it's very complex, but we know that it can be social, the social environment in which I've grown up in. It can be biological, it can be genetics, but it can also be kind of personality as well, personality types. And this really interesting observation that you've made that how we're affected by our upbringing, maybe our parents and the society that we're in, can lead to that conditioning. It can ultimately lead to us then making comparisons with other people. And this is very much the start of the journey that Rory O'Connor talks about in the IMV model before it moves to the next stage where we maybe, start to feel this sense of hopelessness. So I think that's really interesting.
Yes.
So I'm kind of interested to learn about, the conditioning. If the conditioning isn't right, what do you feel that we have to do to better condition ourselves?
Well, I think the first step is to wake up and notice what's happening. So what at HappierMe, what we're trying to do is give people the tools to learn about their own mind. Because it's in that learning that real freedom occurs. See? Because otherwise, that process of comparison will keep going. And no matter where you might be up the ladder, there'll always be somebody you'll compare yourself with and feel awful. And you might get some counseling and breathing and medication and all that to feel better. But if the process continues underneath, you're continually going to suffer. So the first step is, I think, to be sensitive, to realize that's what's happening. So to accept I'm feeling less than, which is not easy sometimes. But the second thing is to be curious. And it's the curiosity that's the key element here. What's going on in my mind to make me feel this way? And unless you see it yourself clearly, nothing's going to change. So then you start journaling. I think journaling is a great way. You write down what's going on. You say, my mind's comparing. That's why I feel bad. Why is it comparing? Or what's it comparing with? Some past. How did that influence? Where did those ideas come from? Oh, they came from my conditioning. Was I aware I'm being conditioned? No, I wasn't. And so on. So once the whole map is laid out, then you can ask yourself, how does that serve me?
This is really interesting because I think, when I think of, what happens in the world of suicide prevention and the treatment, particularly say through the NHS, you're talking here about firstly people accepting that they are feeling less than or feeling hopeless or whatever, and accepting that is really an interesting word, isn't it? Because accepting means that I'm to a degree acknowledging that I've got an issue, and for a lot of people, they don't recognize
I
that
think
what that
acknowledging
issue
might be better than
is.
accepting, Steve, because accepting might also mean I'm resigned, which is not what we're saying. We're not saying you're resigned to it, but we're acknowledging it. Please carry on. But I think that's such an
Yes,
important
no,
word
no, no. I
because
think that's a really, really important distinction that you've made there, because accepting, as I say, does just bring up a different connotation there. But also then to get curious, I think is really, really important, and to try and understand what it is might be making me feel the way I am, and it's something we can do for ourselves. We don't necessarily always need a therapist or a counselor, but clearly that process can help. But I think too often what happens is that people present with symptoms of a mental health issue or excessive stress or depression, and immediately there's a fix, usually related to some form of medication presented to them. But I think if we can much earlier on in the process, much further upstream, help people acknowledge what's happening for them and get curious about it, I think that's really important.
Yes, I'll tell you a story. I worked with a coach, and Joey wouldn't mind me mentioning his name. His name is Joey Polaro. He was one of our coaches in the program. He's based in America. And he said at the age of 13, he started feeling less than others. Came from a really happy family, no problems. But he didn't know, he couldn't make sense of the feeling. See, he couldn't understand. He was just left with this real feeling of feeling less than. And that's when he started drinking. And he said for 30 years, the drink took over his life. And, with all the challenges addiction brings. And he said, short of killing somebody, he did everything else that, is a story for most addicts. And of course, now he's free and he coaches people and so on. But he said something really fascinating. He said, Manoj, if I had known as a young man what I know now, what you're telling me now about conditioning, comparison, and why I feel this way, I would have had a different road in life. So we mustn't underestimate the importance of this understanding.
How important is this in your view that this kind of understanding is something that we teach at a much younger age to
Yes.
young people? And where would you start in terms of
I've been working
young
with
people?
children as part of the HappierMe project as young as 3.
Wow,
And
that is
I
young.
started out with college kids, and then I moved to school, high school, and then primary school. And then there were 10-year-olds. And then the teacher said, no, talk to the 5-year-olds and then talk to the 3-year-olds. Because all we're doing is asking people to be curious about what's happening in their own mind and to go begin this journey of learning. See, we never think the answer lies in us. We think the answer lies out. We think the problem lies out there, and our mind assumes the answer must also lie out there. What we don't realize, as in this example, that the problem begins in our own mind. It's not me personally, it's just the way the human mind is wired. So it's not Manoj's mind or Steve's mind, it's just the way the human mind is. And by the way, comparison serves a really useful purpose in our lives. But just waking up to what's happening and asking, when can I use it in a way that it serves me? And when, so that's really a first piece,
Well,
Steve.
I mean, you've got me curious at the moment, Manoj, because I'm thinking, there you are sitting with a 3-year-old child. It's been a long time since I had a 3-year-old child, I know that, and I'm just trying to imagine that conversation. So I'm curious to learn about how would you have a conversation of that nature with a somebody as young as that?
Well, you just get them to start thinking like, what do you think a good friend should be like? And they'll say, I would like someone to be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we'd say, do you think you're a good friend to somebody else? And and then they're flummoxed, you know what I mean? They started thinking, or
That's really interesting because I mean I know someone who has a young child, a little bit older, and going through some challenges at school at the moment, and concerned that this child isn't making enough friends, and they feel they're not liked at school. So I'm kind of imagining this conversation happening with that child to get
yes,
them curious
get them
about
curious, get them to
what is
start
happening.
learning. But you see, education also needs to take on responsibility because the whole education system is built on comparison. Right? Teachers are graded every week, every month. Somebody sits in your classroom and compares you with a norm. Ofsted comes along and compares you with every other school in the country. The government compares the education system here with grades in Korea and Singapore and all of that. And then every child is compared to the other one. You are successful because you've got 90% in maths. You're a failure because you've got 40%. Maybe numbers are not your game. You'll be Richard Branson in the future, for example, or whatever you might decide is your niche and flourish in that. So I think schools also need to take some responsibility. I'll tell you a story about three children. They're on a video and I can share that. So I asked these three girls who are 10-year-olds, I said, and this is where it begins. I said, so your friend gets more marks in maths than you do. How do you feel? And they said, I hate the subject because I feel that subject is making me feel bad. I hate my friend because I think they're showing off. And I hate myself because I think I'm not good enough. See, now, all these things are happening automatically without their being aware why. And once you explain to them that's what's happening in your own mind that's making you feel that way, and you say, can you live without comparing? And these 10-year-olds said, yeah, I can, I'll try it. And then when I met them 3 months later, they said, yeah, made a real difference, and so on. Do you see what I mean?
That's really interesting. And I think we do this so subconsciously, don't we, now that
Yes.
we make comparisons all the time with comparisons between, with ourselves in terms of how we've performed previously or behaved previously. But often it is external, isn't it? We're comparing it with other people and the lives they have. And clearly this is starting from an early age. What would you like to see schools do, particularly for those early years
Okay, so I think
children?
I think we so teachers themselves are struggling. That's the first thing to realize. They have huge mental health issues. So I think this framework of self-understanding needs to become part of education, probably as young as 7, 8, because I've got some enlightening conversation with 7 and 8-year-olds. And if anyone's interested, please message me or mail me. I'll share them with you. So I think that's when we need to begin, but it needs to become a subject in our education system where you're also, alongside learning about the world, you're learning about yourself and your emotions and your behavior and why you think this way and how to be happy and how to have happier relationships. And it's something all of us need to learn, which is not taught anywhere, as you know, Steve.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it's important that it happens so earlier is, and I'll refer back to Professor Rory O'Connor's IMV model that we talk about all the life events and reasons why people make these comparisons and struggle in life, but we know that the next phase of that process, something that Rory O'Connor calls the motivational phase, is that once these background issues, let's call them, develop to such a point where we start to feel a sense of lack of self-worth completely. We feel hopeless, trapped in our situation, and just completely lacking in self-worth. Those are the times when people start to consider maybe the first time to have suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
So it's so important, I think, that we deal with these issues really early on. And part of our weekly discussions or monthly discussions, I should say, Manoj, is to highlight the work that you're doing now with Happier Me. And I remember when you first showed Happier Me with me, I've seen lots of apps out there, well-being apps that you described everything from tapping to breathing exercises. Many of these things are, can be really helpful at the time, but few of them really went further upstream and started to help people become curious about what was going on in the first place. So one of the things I think people listening today, particularly with the conversation around schools and young people that we've had today, would be to maybe take a little bit of a dive into Happier Me to look at some of those resources that people could get access to. Maybe.
This ache in your heart doesn't go away because you cover it up with drinking, with socializing, and so on. I think one of the factors, Steve, is social media now allows you to compare your life with millions of lives. And so immediately, that subconscious conditioning is just become so powerful. So if you can, try and wean yourself out of social media and use it as a tool that serves you rather than just a way of passing your time or dealing with your inner boredom or, you know. But there's
Yeah,
one
and I think
more thing.
that's a topic in itself, isn't
That's
it,
a
for one of
topic. We'll
our
cover that.
future conversations?
Yeah, yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. We'll
Yeah.
come to that. But there's one more thing to highlight as to why we feel our lives are a failure. It's because, again, a deeper understanding of what our mind does. Our mind takes what it already has for granted and focuses on what we don't have, right? So we take the clothes we're wearing for granted. We take a bed for granted. We take a hot shower for granted. We might take our health for granted. So when I put up this word cloud, I talked to 200 students. I said, what do you want from your life? Happiness was the number one thing in the middle, right? And health was a tiny word in a corner of that word cloud, if you can imagine. I said, why is health so tiny and why is happiness so big? It's because we're already healthy, right? We want the thing we don't have, right?
Makes a lot of
So
sense. Yeah.
when you wake up and you realize this is what your mind is doing, then you can pause and say, okay, let me look at my life with fresh eyes. Let me see all the things that I could be really grateful for and appreciate. And that list is far longer than the list of things that aren't right or could be better or, you know what I mean?
And
So
it comes back to
that's,
being curious again, doesn't it? As
yes,
you said earlier, if we don't ask the questions and get curious, we're not going to be able to make, a better comparison.
yes. I have a stepson, and I remember a couple of years ago we had exactly the same thing. He was feeling terrible about something. And so we did this exercise. We said, okay, we're going to list all the things we can be grateful for and all the people who love you in life. And I think we got to like 60, just over the dining table. And when he'd run out, I'd prompt him, sunshine, trees, blue sky, fresh air, oxygen, all the things. I said, okay, just hold your breath for 1 minute. How do you feel? You know, I said, be grateful for your breath. You see, if you've got nothing else to be grateful for. And then on the other side, we said, okay, how would you like your life to be better? And he had 5 or 6 things on there. I said, see the relative. And then you can, but the thing is also, if you approach the areas you want to improve with a mind that's calm, relaxed, and at peace with itself, you're much more energy to devote to that. So we're not saying feeling good about yourself means having no energy to change. In fact, it's having more energy to change, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We don't give enough time to reflect on what is good in our lives and what we should be grateful for. And it seems that everyone these days, even young people, really young children, are aspiring to have the next best iPhone or the next best virtual game or whatever it is they're after. Continual comparisons, as we've talked about. But sometimes, just I think what really struck me is what you said before: be grateful for your breath, because if we didn't have breath, we just wouldn't be here.
That's right.
It kind of it was one of those moments for me when you said that, and I went, "My goodness, yeah! If we didn't have breath, we wouldn't exist."
Yes.
And nothing else would matter that we've been
Yes.
comparing ourselves with. So I think that's a really, really important point.
Yes. So there are two approaches here, and we'll show you inside. We'll have a look at the app itself. One is you have a problem you want to solve. But it could be that you, like, for example, you go to the gym, right? You don't go to the gym because you have a problem, a knee pain or a back pain to solve. You often just go because you want to remain healthy. You want to invest in your physical health. Similarly, the HappierMe app offers you a toolkit to invest in your mental health by doing the breath work and calming your mind down, doing the meditation, learning about your own mind. So suppose you had learned about this process of comparison in your own mind, then you're free of all the suffering that comes from that. You see what I mean? Going forward. So you've learned something about yourself, you've applied it, and that then doesn't become a source of, illness, mental illness in your life. So we can all invest in our mental health by learning about ourselves and our own mind. And we can work way upstream to prevent us from reaching the point of crisis where you have thoughts of suicide and so on, right? That's the
And
ultimate goal,
that's
right? Of
it is, and I think everyone that I speak to, we use the term upstream a
Mm.
lot. Is obviously from a very famous quote by the wonderful but late Desmond Tutu, and to not continually pull people that are drowning out of the river, but find out why they're falling in the first place. Just to paraphrase that quote. But I think everyone listening to this, certainly anyone I know in my own network, will be listening to this, going, "This is absolutely what we need to
Yes,
be doing." But most as yet have not found a tool or a method, I don't
yes,
think, to enable them to do
yes.
that.
Let me share a conversation I had with some children. So I was working with a school in the Northeast, and the head teacher said, I've got all these kids who have problems. I said, bring them all in. So we had about 10 or 12 kids in the room, in the head teacher's room. And of course, her room had all these plants in. So I started saying to them, do you think this plant is comparing itself with that one?
Brilliant.
And they all started giggling.
Yeah.
And I said, look out of the window and look at all these different trees. Do you think they compare themselves with each other? Or are they happy? And there was a bird in the in the courtyard singing. And I said, do you think birds compare themselves with each other and their songs and feel terrible? Or they just sing for the joy of it? And then it suddenly dawned on them that as far as nature is concerned, nature doesn't compare. See? And we forget that we're part of nature. See? We all are our own unique tree in the world. And we need to celebrate
So,
the life we
I,
have.
well, the message clearly coming across, Manoj, is we need to be more tree.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Be more tree.
absolutely. Be
Yes.
more tree. I think that could be a new hashtag
Because
for us.
there's
That
so many beautiful analogies there. It grows, it flourishes, it flowers, it has its own shape and direction in life, and it celebrates the life we have. See, if you can find your own peace in yourself, which you can through this inner work, and I use the word work deliberately because it requires you to invest time. If you can find this peace in yourself, you have something, a treasure that few human beings have. And it doesn't depend on what's happening in your life on the outside. How much money you have, what job you have, what car you drive, and so on. But if you can find that happiness and peace in yourself, then you want for really nothing more, right? That's
uh,
ultimately what every human being wants. They want to be happy.
I think that's really, really important. And I'm glad you made the comment about investing time as well, because I think we live in a culture where we expect quite often quick fixes.
Yes.
We go to an app and expect that video or that podcast or whatever it might be to be able to cure what we're going through. So I think the fact you said you've got to invest some time in this is really important. Well, I know the time is racing by already, but I think it'd be really useful just to dip briefly into the Happier
Yes,
Me
let's have a
app to
look at that.
demonstrate
Yeah,
a couple
and
of
of
things
course
there.
the website is happierme.app, and the you can download the app as well.
We'll make sure we put all the links
We'll
in
put the
the
links
show
in. Okay.
notes and everything there.
So
Yeah.
it's a digital platform. So basically, it allows you to see it on the desktop or on your phone. And it starts off with a Feel Better Now section. So no matter what you might be feeling, and say you're feeling stressed because you feel less than others. And so we do provide tools to put the fire out so you feel better with breathing and meditations and videos and a podcast. But then we invite you to go deeper, to understand understand stress in detail so you can learn how to respond with your own inner wisdom or intelligence to the problem. Or, for example, there's a module on conditioning, which helps you to understand how this process of conditioning works and the 100 different ways it shapes your life without your own awareness. So, we're not at all saying conditioning is right or wrong. We're just saying it operates in a way where you are not in charge or not aware. And the more you become aware, the more you can be the captain of your own ship, the master of your own life. And that's, I think, the key in the whole thing. So there's a Feel Better Now section, there's a daily practice, and there are 8 broad topics to explore. Mental health is one of them. We have breathing exercises, modules on depression, stress, anxiety, bullying, all sorts. Um, there's life stories, guided questions. There's one on dealing with your inner critic, for example, videos, podcasts, meditations, and blogs. Now, for the topic that we're exploring today, there are 2 modules I'd like users to look at. One is called comparison. So you just type the word comparison in here, comparison in envy, and that brings up, hang on. If you go to explore pathway program, understand how your mind works, that's where it is. So once you type in comparison, you'll learn all the different ways our mind compares. And it's the learning that brings the change. See, that's the key thing. Also in the explore section is a module on self-esteem. And this again helps users develop a positive or a healthy self-esteem rather than a negative one. So those are the few things, Steve, that we would, rather than overwhelm people with too much, look at the module on comparison, self-esteem, the Feel Better Now section, and maybe explore the mental health section for yourself. There's
Yeah,
much
that's
more
really good
content.
because it is comprehensive. I mean, I've been obviously invested in the app, and there's a huge level of resource in there. So I think that's really useful just to guide
Yeah,
people
just two
really,
or three
really
things you could do
specifically.
in relation to this topic on, low self-esteem, feeling like a failure. There's a module on success and failure as well, so you can look at that. Um,
Fantastic. Well, we the title of our very first A Happier Me podcast is Feelings of Being a Failure. But I think during this conversation, we've hopefully left people feeling quite hopeful. I think certainly it's been a very positive conversation. I hope everyone listening and watching has found this useful. I'm sure that there's some amazing takeaways for me personally, being part of this podcast. But as I say to everyone listening, we are going to record these each month. There'll be future episodes on different topics that we will forecast and let you know ahead of time. But what did you think? Did you enjoy our conversation with Manoj and myself today? Would you like to leave some comments on the social media posts that we've shared this and in the YouTube links as well? Let us know what you think. Let us know what topics are really important to you as well. But Manoj, great to catch up again. Enjoyed our conversation to be able to share it with everyone
well, Steve,
listening
thank you. What we're trying to
today.
do is bring some light to the world, reduce suffering, help people lead happier lives, make the world a better place, and to realize that the answer to your suffering lies in you.
Really important message to end on. Manoj, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.